Hey folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk all the time about the Fab Four. Anything we feel like talking about. The group years, the solo years, the music, the albums, their history, whatever we feel like talking about at the time, that's what we do here on this channel. And we have special guests that we welcome all the time here. Ken McNab is my special guest on today's show. Back in 2019, he put out this book called And in the End, The Last Days of the Beatles. And it all concerns the year 1969, and Ken goes through it in detail, month by month. And I had a great time interviewing him when that book came out. We did an audio interview, which you can find on my website in its entirety. And he was also featured in my radio program, Every Little Thing. And now he has a brand new book out, which I'll talk about in just a few moments, which is called You Started It. You could show it right there. And we'll
Shameless
tell
plug. Shameless
okay,
plug.
we'll tell you what that's all about in just a few moments. Ken, it's the battle of the Kens here on this channel. Welcome to Ken Michaels Radio.
Hello, Ken. It's absolutely brilliant to talk to you again in my usual dulcet tones, which is a combination of Sean Connery and Billy Connolly.
Okay. And maybe if somebody needs someone to do an impression of either of them, they can call on you.
Well, I could do. I used to. I mean, I do love them both, but I used to be able to do the sort of Connery and the Untouchables, which was, so you want to get Capone? Here's how you get Capone. One of his men pulls a knife, one of your men pulls a gun. He puts one of your men in the hospital, you put one of his men in the morgue. That's how you get Capone. That's the Chicago way.
Boy, you sold me right there. The
Not really.
voiceovers, the voiceovers are going to come in droves right now for you, just from that
I
impression.
wish.
Well, in case you haven't noticed, Ken is indeed from Scotland, and got, I need to have more accents here on this channel, more British people, definitely more Scottish people, and certainly anytime we do a show on Mull of Kintyre, I'm going to call on Ken to be part of that. But anyway, I thought first of all, what we talk about before we get to your new book, um, since your book And in the End covered 1969, and it did it brilliantly, month by month, so you knew thoroughly what was going on in the lives of the Beatles, not just what they were recording, but their personal lives. Um, since then, perhaps the biggest event for Beatle fans, certainly in my opinion, since the Beatles anthology, was the Get Back documentary directed by Peter Jackson. And I know you saw it. I wanted to know what your impressions were of Get Back, and also if it changed your perception of that month of January of 69 and what followed.
Yeah, well, is it right from straight off the bat, Ken, when Peter Jackson announced that he was going to embarking on the Get Back project, and given how much access he would have to all the tapes, my first real concern was, well, have I got it wrong? In essence, because, that he'll be able to dial down into, and peel back the sediment of time and history much better than I would have had at the time, simply through point of access. So the first thing that went through my mind was, oh my goodness, what happens if I got it wrong? What happens if all my research pointed in a different direction? What happens if I paid too much attention to previous narratives and I hadn't done my homework? I mean, anybody who undertakes a book about the Beatles really has to, it's not done glibly. It's not done, on a whim. I mean, we all try and get it right. I think Mark Lewison's on record somewhere as saying that, that even he doesn't get everything right, but he takes the view that if he can get upwards of 85% to 90% right, then he thinks he's doing well. He's obviously well above that mark. But so that was a kind of template of my thinking in a sense. But when it came out, and the first thing to say is I love Peter Jackson. I'm a huge Peter Jackson fan. I'm surrounded here by Lord of the Rings memorabilia, and some of it is really fascinating. I took my son to see Fellowship of the Ring when he was 6 years old, and it was a real bond for us. and I've got a Lego Barradur set over there in the corner. So, you know, I'm a genuine fan of what he did with the films. And I was intrigued, like anybody else, to wonder what he would bring to the table. But when I saw the film in its entirety, and it is a long undertaking, after I watched it a couple of times, I actually kind of breathed a sigh of relief, Ken, because it didn't change my thinking overall. And the reason for that is because I think that although it's well intentioned, and fans will lap it up simply through, if you're prepared to endure the marathon-esque time to watch it, then it's brilliantly put together, and there's a lot of very interesting and compelling moments. But at the same time, I do think that there's a lot of revisionism in it, and a revisionism attached to the whole project. I mean, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr were obviously on board and bigged it up, talked it up, and they had to talk it up. And there was obviously a residue of bad feeling when Get Back / Let It Be was being produced in January 1969. They were all at a low ebb, personally and creatively. But when I saw the film, it didn't change my thinking that much, I have to say, because, you know, I think that, as I say, there was a lot of revisionism done, and the film shows them. The film does show them, I think most people will agree, in a happier place than history would lead you to believe. But at the same time, you know, it painted, if you like, a broader and ostensibly happier picture of the doomed Get Back project. But there's a preponderance of footage, Ken, where you've got them singing in funny voices, mugging to the camera, you know, and the sessions just seem to go on and on, and they do look miserable at key moments. So I didn't think that, I'd put it this way, I didn't think I had got my perception wrong. I feel that, although, as I said, it's well intentioned, it doesn't alter an ineluctable truth. And the ineluctable truth is that this was a band that by 1969, in my opinion, had simply run out of road. And it just so happened that, you know, the end of the road was Abbey Road. But they had run out of road. You know, you can tell in their personalities. And I mean, you know, there are some great moments, you know, when you see McCartney plucking Get Back out of the air, sure, you know, from a very small seed and becoming this mighty oak, in a sense. I mean, that's a moment for the ages, and it just shows you how effortless his genius is. But at the same time, you know, I mean, you know, George is in equal measure. He's surly and truculent, and a bit prickly. Lennon, for quite long periods, looks slightly detached and monosyllabic, defers to Yoko almost at every turn. Ringo's just happy to go along for the ride. And then, of course, you have Paul as the cheerleader in chief, you know, but he veers from that position of being a cheerleader in chief to adopting a very passive-aggressive stance to try and motivate them all, to try and build some momentum. So much as I enjoyed it, it was a long watch. Sometimes there was a lot of navel gazing went on. I mean, every band in the world has been through these moments where, you know, the spark isn't quite there. But at the same time, I think you have to remember, Ken, that you have to remember the sort of chain reaction of songwriting that took place. I mean, they didn't just you know, put together most of Let It Be, but half of Abbey Road, and notwithstanding that, a couple of songs that ended up in solo albums, like Give Me Some Truth, sure, Backseat of My Car, Jealous Guy. So, you know, there's a bit of a dichotomy here, and I don't want people to think that I'm saying one thing and meaning another. There are some really treasured moments between and really loving moments between four guys, but I can't escape the notion that really by January 1969, they were really done, and nothing I saw overall has led me to change my mind on that.
Wow, that's fascinating, your take on that. First of all, it concerns me that you said that there's revisionism here, only because I know that Peter Jackson has said that he was kind of given carte blanche to do whatever he wanted to do. I never heard that Paul and Ringo tried to interfere or make suggestions in any way.
No, I just think when I say revisionism, I should maybe clarify that. I feel that the revisionism that was attached to the whole media hype, if you like, that before Jackson had ever sat down in an acetate room and started to piece together all the different Niagara roles, if you like,
Hmm.
um, and I mean, everybody at the time accepted it was a pretty miserable experience. But when the opportunity came to revisit this project, then I think Paul especially and Ringo, saw an opportunity here to redress history in a sense, and give the impression that, I know that history has said that we were in a bad place, but really, when you look at the overall, it wasn't as bad as people have made out, which is possibly true, because when you're seeing an overall picture, then your perspective can change, and I accept that. But in when everything's compacted, when you're looking for a snapshot, it was hard, I think, to come away from the overall impression, for me anyway, that while there are some brilliant moments of togetherness, I couldn't help feeling that really they were abandoned life support in a sense, and nothing really changed that. I mean, it's very easy when I say revisionism. It's really easy. It shouldn't be forgotten that not long after Let It Be, they did regroup for Abbey Road and made the best of it. But then you had the Lennon the last photographic session at Tittenhurst in August,
Hmm.
and you just have to look at them. I mean, if the old cliche about a picture telling 1,000 words, well, there's about 10,000 words in these pictures. They clearly just are miserable together. Either they needed to take a sabbatical, or else it was really, it's all over now, baby blue. And if you want to take that discussion, extend it further down the line, when Let It Be was coming out, when the actual album was coming out a year later, and there was all the discord over when Paul's first solo album was going to come out and when Let It Be was going to come out, and there was this slight crossover,
Hmm.
and George Harrison, I think I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think George Harrison sent Paul a very succulent letter, putting him in his place and telling him that in no uncertain terms what was going to happen. And by the way, you'll stay in the label, when there was all talk about whether, Apple would just splinter into four directions.
Well, the whole Beatle breakup is so complicated, and at the same time, it's fascinating. And you can talk for hours on end on that subject. And it becomes even more interesting because of all that was going on in their lives at the time. I personally found Get Back to be so fascinating because I think between watching them at Twickenham first, where they certainly had their problems, it was a world of difference once they went to Apple
Absolutely.
to work there.
Definitely. Most definitely.
And just to see the dynamic between John and Paul in particular, that Paul felt like he had to really drive the band, even though he has said in interviews that he didn't want to be like the leader of the group. He sort of became that, after Brian Epstein died, and he had to come up with ideas to drive the band to do certain things. But he didn't want to have to be in that position, and I think he felt uncomfortable about it. And also, it's kind of interesting from the very beginning when I saw a promo for Get Back, the whole idea behind this movie, they turned it into they only have 1 month. Can they pull this off? Can they record a whole album? Can they do a concert? Can they do a TV special? And with songs all from scratch. And when you take it from that kind of perspective, and that's the storyline right there. It's a fascinating study to see whether they can pull it off. And after Twickenham, once John sort of takes the lead in the group, you can feel like the pressure was off Paul. He was enjoying it so much more. They were having a lot of fun with all their songs, including George's songs, you know. So, and I've also said the camera doesn't lie. So you get both sides. You can see how they can be unhappy one minute and then joyous the next. And, you know, that could be what happens in so many bands. But look, we have the knowledge of all the problems that the Beatles were facing around that time, and it was escalating. And, you know, I've never been somebody that ever felt that the Beatle breakup was a tragedy, because they all went on to have solo careers and successful solo careers. And I think that new generations of Beatle fans should know about that a lot more, and that should be brought more to the fold, that all four of them survived on their own. So, you know, I don't look at it as being like the end of the world when the Beatles broke up. And I know that at certain times in interviews you've given, you've kind of expressed the same thing, that it was time and it wasn't all that tragic that they
No,
that they broke.
absolutely not. I subscribe to that judgment absolutely 100%. You know, I mean, they were having personal differences and creative differences, but you know, I just think that perhaps, Ken, that they were a product of their time, and it was the right time when Abbey Road was finished for them to step off the page, and they step off the page and into history. You know, I'm looking here. I've got the Abbey Road cover here on the wall, and every time I look at it, it's like the famous war poem. Is it John Bunyan's war poem? You know, the age shall not wither them.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I see these four guys in that legendary moment. As I say, stepping off the page and into history, and that image shows them frozen in a sense in rock and roll amber, and they don't change. That's my last image of the Beatles as a band. It's not the miserable Tittenhurst pictures. It's that image there where there's a sense of togetherness, there's a sense of, you know, being a band for almost the last time. And I'm glad that they did split up when they did, because not only did they leave us this incredible musical legacy, which will never be surpassed, it also meant, Ken, that they didn't become their own tribute band. It didn't mean that you then have a decreasing quality year after year after year, and the only thing you have to look forward to is what they did in the past. So I'm quite happy that they split when they did. You know, I mean, much as I love the Stones, they long ago ceased to have any cultural or commercial relevance, really, although the records are still good. But it's not the same as when you're on it at the peak of your creative powers as a group, you know, swimming in the same direction. And I'm certainly of the opinion that when the Beatles split, it was the right thing to do. It may have been a happy accident. I'm sure, you know, we've all heard about the possibilities of reunions. It would never have been the same. It would never have been the same. It can't possibly have been the same, because, you know, they were different guys. They moved personally into different areas of their life. It's only natural. I mean, as Lennon said, it's only natural. It's not a big deal. It's only a rock group that's split up. So people do, you know, I mean, do you hang out with the guys that you were at high school together? You
Only
might.
a few.
Only a few, but I don't really, you know, and I've not got any great attraction about going back in that direction. I think that fences were mended up to a point, but not quite the same between Lennon and McCartney as it was, because how could it be, you know? So no, I have absolutely no regrets. You know, when they split, and fame and fate, maybe it was fate telling them that this is your moment to head off into the sunset.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say all this. You'll probably never find anybody who's a stronger supporter of the Beatles' solo careers as I am. But to me, and this is no disrespect to all the other great groups who are still together and periodically put out new albums like the Rolling Stones or the Who, but I think it says so much more when every member survived on his own. the way that the Beatles did. I mean, that's such an incredible accomplishment to itself, instead of relying on the name of the band. But that's just my own personal opinion. But the flip side of that is that, like you said, they're frozen in time. People have this perfect image of them. They left while they were on top. And so there'll always be those people that crave a reunion no matter what, and nothing could ever compare in their eyes to what they were like when they were together. So, you know, yes, it's a great thing to leave with an album like Abbey Road, although it was Let It Be came after that, but Abbey Road was the one they recorded last. But to leave on such a high and be the most, beloved band in the world, some people will always want to cling on to the past, and wish for, a reunion. Even after John died, there were people that wanted the three of them to get together. So
Yeah, I mean, they have become history's greatest legacy band. They have, I mean, their influence even today, I mean, it's ridiculous. We shouldn't really be talking about a band that actually split up half a century ago. I mean, it's crazy. It's mad.
Yeah.
And maybe, but there's always a sort of, a desire for nostalgia. I understand that. And I'm as guilty as anybody. I mean, I sit up here and you're inexorably drawn back to whether it be Revolver or the White Album or the first album, and it's like, why do I keep going back? I mean, I've heard them countless times, but
Right.
every time I go back, I hear something different, and sometimes in a song I haven't heard for a while, I think, that's really good. I mean, take a song like I Saw Her Standing There. It's like the sound of a Learjet on the runway of the 60s. That magnificent countdown, 1, 2, 3, 4, wow! And it's like a jet taking off, and that is the sound of the 60s starting to move down the runway. And every time I hear it, I think, wow. Even today, I was looking at some of the BBC footage of Glastonbury in the summer with McCartney, and I must admit, I was looking at it through the cracks of my fingers because, he's 80. What do you expect? The voice isn't going to be as strong. And actually, I thought it was magical. It was really magical. And I think these two young guys he's got playing with him, Springsteen and Grohl, I think they have a future in this game. I do. I think they've got potential.
I think you're premature in saying that. They got to prove themselves first. So let's talk a little bit, touch upon just lightly your book from a few years ago, And in the End, which I highly recommend to anyone who hasn't read this yet. There's a few things you brought up in the book that I found to be rather interesting. I shouldn't say a few, a lot, but we're just going to hit on a few of them. I don't really see that much written about the performance that Yoko and John did at Cambridge University, which you had said was kind of significant in their lives.
Well, it was significant insofar as it was one of the first things that they did together in a live setting, and it was very much an avant-garde project, and the audience were expecting an avant-garde performance, and when they see John Lennon coming up with a guitar, then there was confusion, right? Because they're thinking, well, what's the rock and roll guy doing here? This is not his bag, as it were. But it was significant because it was really Yoko's crowd, if you like. And I was quite amazed. I mean, with everything you do, Ken, you try and bring something new to the table, and the only way you can do that is to try and speak to people who were in their actual orbit at the time, so that you gain some A, perspective, and B, context, because otherwise what happens is that stories become legends and legends become myths. So with that particular performance and that particular occasion, then I was lucky enough to find somebody who was actually an eyewitness to history, if you like, and he was able to shade in some blanks about what happened, and that made it a much more fascinating story rather than just the bare bones of what actually took place.
Right. And there was a problem in the fact that John and Yoko released that their performance, which was
Yeah,
called
the guy,
Cambridge
yeah,
1969. Yeah.
the guy who was organising it, his name has just escaped me, but he felt that he had the legal rights to the recording, if you like. So there was a bit of legal to and fro between the two of them. When Yoko and John obtained the tapes and wanted to put it out as part of their own solo oeuvre, and John and Yoko, with the powerful backing of Apple, really it was a disagreement that was only going to end one way, really. But this guy carried a torch for this particular disagreement down through the decades. So he wasn't exactly complimentary about them, but that doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, all you're doing is trying to, find somebody who will give you some truth, in a sense.
Right. And I guess John found this very liberating for him, because he was basically playing a lot of feedback during
Absolutely,
Yoko's, and that was just, so different for him, and this is before Live Peace in Toronto. And yeah, so instead of doing what people would expect of him, like in his Beatle days, and doing a rock song and singing live, singing lead vocals, he's doing something completely different. So, he got a lot of enjoyment out of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, this was right outside his comfort zone. I mean, this is nowhere near She Loves You, Tomorrow Never Knows. It's complete. It's much more in tune with what she was best known for, which is this radical approach to, like music concrete, like conceptual art. But he was happy to go along with it, and at that time they were very much together and very much a couple. Creative, not just personally but creatively, and they were beginning to form that John and Yoko partnership, if you like, in the eyes of the public. But it would still have been a bit of a jaw-dropping moment for the people who were actually there. But Lennon, by all accounts, loved it. And you can see some of that performance art informed his later music, particularly as a solo artist.
Now, one of the things that I really appreciated you bringing up in your book was when we had the Vietnam War protest in Washington, where 500,000 people sang "Give Peace a Chance." And John and Yoko they were in Scotland at the time, right?
I think they may have been in Greece, actually.
Okay.
If memory serves me right, and as you get to my vintage, the memory engrams start to fade. But I think they may have been in Greece on holiday. But either way, he certainly, Lennon was an inveterate watcher of the news, and he had an insatiable appetite for current events. And it was definitely a proud moment for him when that happened in America at that time. Yeah.
And it made him feel like he has something to say and he was taken seriously with his political views.
Well, certainly in his eyes, validated his political views. I mean, in the UK, I think they were dismissed as a couple of eccentric clowns. I mean, let's go and spend a week in bed for peace. I mean, they just didn't get it. The English media, very straight laced. There ain't no funny bone there.
Right.
And but in America, the contrast was that they were regarded as serious artists, and there's a world of difference. And for Lennon especially, he just felt that he was taken much more seriously in America, and his politics were taken much more serious. He was viewed as a cultural icon and not just another dissolute pop star. He was much more than that. He was a serious figure who had serious things to say, and he was also viewed as, certainly through the eyes of American youth, I think, along with Dylan, but differently, as a real leader of the counter culture movement.
Hmm. Yeah, but that seemed to have been a very important moment that affected him and Yoko, I think, when he saw
Well,
that happened.
I mean, can you imagine? I mean, can you imagine seeing, as you say, 500,000, quarter of a million, 500,000 people singing your song?
Right,
And the song, remember, had already faded from the charts because the song was recorded in June, and it had its moment. It
right.
had its 15 minutes of fame. So for it to be brought back into public consciousness the way it was would have been a defining moment for him. Absolutely.
Yeah. What a proud moment that had to have been for the two of them.
And I think it also helped to cement the relationship between Lennon, the artist, and the American public of all ages, incidentally, not
Hmm.
just young people. But I think that was the moment where perhaps he transitioned from being just a mere pop star to somebody who was a genuine spokesman for his generation.
Hmm. Okay. You also bring up the fact in '69, obviously Ringo was doing the Magic Christian, and he took his acting very seriously, you say in your book.
Well, he did because he was the other three had their songwriting, and Ringo just had was just identified. He's just a drummer. But as Lennon always said, that Ringo had traits in his personality which he believed would have manifested themselves even if he hadn't been in the Beatles. I mean, he wouldn't have been as famous, obviously, but Lennon felt that Ringo's personality was so huge that he would have found a niche role in entertainment in some form or another.
Hmm.
So it's only that. I mean, the old cliche, Ken, that when it came to films, all he had to do was act naturally. But you and I both know that there's a lot more to it than that.
Right.
And he took it seriously, and he studied his craft. He was very friendly with Peter Sellers, who was in the Magic Christian. And for a time, that gave Ringo an identifiable string to his own bow, in a sense, and gave him something else to do out with the band. I think it was important to him. Yeah.
Well, he had to be thinking about what would he do if the band didn't continue at some
Well,
point.
after Lennon's famous "I Want a Divorce" announcement in September '69, I
Hmm.
think Ringo, and yet you can understand why. I think Ringo went home to his garden and looked into the great wide open and thought, "What the hell am I going to do now?"
Hmm.
Because at the end of the day, he's not a songwriter. He's not a natural. He wouldn't command. He couldn't have a solo career at that point, which perhaps would have worked. So yeah, he's looking into the bleak midwinter of his own life. And remember something. Here's something that people often forget. In 1969, Ken, not one of them is older than 30 years old. They're all under 30. I mean,
Hmm.
they're all young guys, and people often forget, that they're not even 30. So at that point, Ringo Starr's looking at the short and the long term of his life and thinking, well, where do I go from here? And
Yeah,
that's only natural. That's only natural.
it is amazing to think that the Beatles created that whole body of work as a band before any of them turned 30. It's just so remarkable when you think about that.
It is absolutely, yeah.
And also, the mixed emotions that truthfully all four of them must have had about the breakup. Part of them, I'm sure, was relieved to some degree, and then part of them was, afraid. They had this security blanket for all these years, being, the band that everybody loved the most around the world. So
Yeah, I think there's
must have been.
also if you remove the band element, if you park that to one side, then the other element that comes into play really is that these guys really were a band of brothers. I mean, they were really tight,
Mhm.
and I'm sure you've seen the end of the anthology series where Ringo really does choke up, and then it's hard not to choke up with him when you see him. When he talks about four guys, a hotel room here or a session here, and four guys who really loved each other.
Right.
And it's an emotional punch to the solar plexus, because you can tell he means it, you know. And I can't think of a band where they really were as tight. You know, I'm sure there are bands through the ages where they've been really good friends, but somehow with the Beatles, you just knew that, you know, they were four sides of the one square. And if you removed one of them, then it doesn't work. So yeah, I mean, I get it. You know, Ringo was always the most emotional and sentimental of them all, and it would have been devastating for him. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when you've been through everything that the Beatles did, more than just the recording and the success, they were a family. You know, and
Absolutely.
Ringo always referred to John, Paul, and George as his three brothers, and I'm sure they all felt that same way. So, yeah. So why don't we talk a little bit about the new book, which you can hold up again,
Well, the
called
new book, da, 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 da. The
You
new book
Started It.
is called You Started It. No, you started it. No, you started it. It sounds a very Scottish thing to say, actually. You started it. And it's a deep dive into some of the most pernicious feuds in music history. I've seen through the eyes not just of the band members themselves, but, you know, people who knew them well, and can offer some viewpoint, some observations, and some perspective on what really happened. So there are 17 chapters, and it runs the whole gamut of music from the Everly Brothers, Simon and Garfunkel, Fleetwood Mac, Pink Floyd, The Clash, The Supremes, the Eagles, the Police, Tupac and Biggie Smalls, the Kinks. So there's a whole roster of bands in there. And the thing to say right away is that I love all these bands. You know, all of them have left an indelible footprint on music's landscape, and there's not one of them I don't love. But at the same time, it's, you know, it doesn't take much in music and bands for a stairway to heaven, if you like, to suddenly become a highway to hell. And you know, it's a bit like a car crash. You know, you don't want to look at the car crash, but you're drawn to the fascination of it as you drive past. You wonder what happened. And rock and roll is littered with bands who, you know, behind the scenes there's been terrible toxic bust ups, and they're just fascinating. You know, they're fascinating.
No doubt about it. And you do have a chapter in there on John and Paul.
I do have a chapter in John and Paul. I've also got one in Mick and Keith, because I wanted the Stones to be in there, and Mick and Keith were the sort of polar opposite, or the, you know, antithesis of John and Paul, in a sense, the mirror image of John and Paul, I should say. But you couldn't do it and not have Lennon and McCartney in there. And we touched on that moment where, you know, it's like a sliding doors moment where they leave the band and suddenly they're facing a completely different future. And I don't think there's any doubt that, and I don't want people to get the wrong impression that I've been very cynical about the relationship between these people, because quite often friction can be a force for creative good. But in the case of John and Paul, that friction became really, it fed into a sort of public battleground after the Beatles, which was a great shame, I think. You know, that they waged war on each other. I mean, all of a sudden you went from being the best of friends and a band of brothers to this dissonance, this sort of, you know, terrible sniping from the sidelines. And the war is conducted through their songs. Obviously, How Do You Sleep is the best known example of that. And it's a bit of a shame. You know, I mean, McCartney had a few digs at Lennon in some of his earlier solo work, and you know, Lennon being Lennon, you know, he's not going to stand in ceremony. He's just going to get right down to the nitty gritty and be as forthright as only John Lennon could be. But it's a sad thing. But, you know, I tried to again speak to some people who knew them in the early 70s, who had a foot in both camps, if you like, so that they could again give you some kind of window on what was really happening in their lives. I mean, was it as bad as as history is made out, or were there some moments of serious détente between them? And of course, unfortunately, hovering in the background is Banco's ghost, if you like, which is Alan Klein. And I think that while Klein was on the scene, it made rapprochement between Lennon and McCartney slightly difficult. And it was only, of course, when Lennon, Harrison, and Ringo Starr got shot of Alan Klein that relations began to be a bit warmer in a sense. But it's a shame, I think most people would have been quite happy for them to have conducted their personal relationships on a much more warmer keel, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, that's the only thing that I find disappointing about it, is that it maybe, I mean, we weren't there during when the Beatles were together and what they said to each other, but it seemed to me like maybe communication wasn't that strong between them, and John would voice his anger and his problems publicly instead of maybe confronting Paul with them.
Yeah, nowadays it's very fashionable for rock stars who fall out to weaponize social media and turn it into this toxic echo chamber. But in those days, all they had were the music magazines, Rolling Stone and Your Side of the Pond, and we had NME or the Melody Maker. So, and if one of them had a go at the other, then right away next week, the other one would want a right of reply right away. So it became this terrible tit for tat in a sense, By the way, I mean, as a journalist myself, you think, thank you very much. I mean, it's great copy. I mean, I don't care. I mean, if they want, as a journalist, if that's what they want to say, then be my guest. But from a fan's point of view, I think it leaves it didn't do that either of them any favors at the time, and it didn't enhance their public image at the time either. And I think they were both genuinely hurt by some of the things that were said. But I think Linda McCartney's on record as saying, Ken, that you rightly touched on it yourself. The real problem here is communication. But guys being guys, they're not very good at that. I mean, speaking as a guy, and the last time I checked, definitely a guy. We're not very good at trying to be honest with each other. Or trying to find a way around unsolvable solutions. And it's not difficult. I think Linda McCartney was saying that, I'm just this chick from New York. What do I know? But she took the view that if she could just have got the two of them in a room together to thrash out their differences, and then maybe, the Stones have done it. Stones have done it countless times over the years where they've had terrible fallouts and Mick, and that's exactly what happened. Is that Jagger and Richards got in a room, and for the first hour, you said this to me in the Daily Mirror. And you told the New York Times that I was this, and once the bitching stops, then you can maybe find yourself in a better moment. And at the end of the day, it becomes slightly comical. But you didn't really say that, did you? So.
And I tell you, one of my favorite moments going back to the Get Back documentary is John and Paul having that conversation in the cafeteria where they're trying to work out, how do you handle George and how unhappy he is in the band. So there's a moment there where they're communicating. And it's really nice to see that,
Absolutely. It's one of the more heartwarming moments of Get Back when you see them, how do we bring them back into the fold? In a sense, I don't think, if you think about it, how strong the ties that bind were, but sometimes it comes down to male ego and pride, and nobody wants to be the one who's going to blink first, and as I've said before, their lives were moving in different directions. It's not just, who knows what was been said in the bitter watches of a night when it comes down to what maybe Yoko's view and things were, what Linda's view were. You've got two very strong women as well there, and naturally they're in their husbands' corners. So it's not just about the two guys. There are other elements in play as well that don't always make, nobody. For all everybody was singing "Give Peace a Chance," after the Beatles split up, there really wasn't too much evidence of that for a short time.
Hmm. Now, at the beginning of this article on John and Paul, you just bring up the fact that there were two camps created. There were John fans and there were Paul fans. And this was kind of, I don't know, the media brought this on. Or in a way, I feel like John helped to bring it on with his interview with Rolling Stone to air out all of his problems about the problems he had with Paul. And I don't fully understand. I was young at the time. I just loved all four Beatles. I didn't, say I'm a John person or I'm a Paul person, but this was going on at the time and it caused a division, among fans and in the press too. I mean, why do you suppose that needed to happen?
I think you have to be a first generation Beatles fan, and I'm a child of the 70s, not the 60s. I think you have to be a first generation Beatle fan to understand the dichotomy between the two camps. Paul was always the sweet looking Beatle, the PR charmer. John was much more abrasive. So they would appeal to and always had appealed to two distinct groups of fans. And it's a bit like they had grown up with them, and it's a bit like you don't want to see your parents bickering, and you don't want to see your parents reaching that point where a relationship cannot be repaired. And if you're a child in that household, it's a very painful thing to have to go through, where you watch your parents moving in different directions, separating, and then ultimately there's a horrible, horrible, horrible divorce. And who do you go? Who do you veer towards? Do you veer towards one parent, or do you go towards the other? And no matter what you do, you're caught in this terrible no man's land. So I can understand why at that time there were distinct factions of Paul fans and John fans. But John's interview, his excoriating interview with Rolling Stone, was certainly the equivalent of Pandora's box creaking open, and all the furies coming out. And I think at that point there would have been disappointment, not just with Paul, but probably with George and Ringo and their extended families. But John's fidelity to the truth was absolute. So once he had started, there was no way of being able to put the words back in. As he said to, he encourages Jan Wenner to ask the questions. He says right at the start, "Don't be shy." Well, if you're Jan Wenner, you just think, "Thank you very much, thank you very much." But as I say, they weaponized the music press at the time, and I think it. I don't think relations were ever really normalized. We've all read about the various, the visits that took place, and I think it was Los Angeles in '74, and then at the Dakota in '76. But you can't reheat a souffle; it was never the same. And for that reason, that's why they could never get back together. It was never going to be the same.
Because you do say, I think it's in this article, that after Paul sued the other Beatles, I mean, it could never be the same as it once was. Even though the other three came around where Alan Klein was concerned and realized that it was a mistake to sign him, But still, I mean, I always feel like in Paul's mind, the one thing that hurt him more than anything else was the other three siding with Klein against him. So there was a lot of pain on his side too.
Yeah, I mean, whenever anybody asks people like yourself and I, Ken, about who broke up the Beatles, there's a myriad of reasons, and you cannot point your finger to one specific thing. But the one specific thing that perhaps points to it more than any other is the involvement of Alan Klein, because McCartney just hated him from the off. His gut instinct was that this guy was a hustler. He wasn't somebody you could trust. And it was very difficult because you have this democracy in the Beatles, where, you know, if one guy doesn't want to swim in the same direction as the rest, then they don't do it. And this was a very tricky situation because the other three were clearly sold in Klein. Well, when I say the other three, really Lennon was sold in them, and then Lennon's pitch was very persuasive to the others, and they naturally fell in line with him, and it made for a very awkward situation. And you know, I always think of Alan Klein as the Goblin King of the Beatles story, and you know, I think if there was one key element to the band breaking up, I think I would look at the moment that he entered from stage left as a pretty significant factor in them breaking up. And as you rightly say, when he was no longer on the scene, then I think it created an opening for relations to be a little bit warmer, shall we say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you view How Do You Sleep? I mean, in your article, you said that was like a new low for John Lennon.
Well, first of all, it's a great track. It's a great track, and people sometimes forget that. You know, it's got you know, it's a brilliant track. It's full of typical. It's typically acerbic from Lennon. It's a pity that the lyrics masked or clouded what was a great song. I think it really did. It did really hit McCartney in the worst possible place. I mean, you know, if you're going to suggest that if you're going to mock him over his songwriting abilities, and you bring his you know, his creation of Yesterday, which is probably, you know, at that time the baby, you know, his baby, and it's like attacking. It's like somebody attacking your child. I mean, you know, it really was quite a low blow.
Yeah.
Not helped with it by the fact that George also plays on the track and contributes some stinging guitar work on it. I mean, exemplary. I mean, it's fantastic. It's a great track. Lennon later tried to suggest that really it wasn't about Paul, it was really about him. But I don't think anybody in any circumstances could possibly believe that. But it's a pity, you know. I mean, you know, one or two witnesses said that the lyrics were even more were much worse than what actually appeared on the finished record.
Right.
So I'm glad we didn't go down. I think maybe one or two people have heard various outtakes. But it's a pity that the lyrics overshadowed what was really quite a good song.
I'll agree. Musically, it's just you know, melodically, the orchestration, as you said, George's guitar work is stunning on there. You know, just kind of wish that maybe there were different lyrics and it was a different subject.
Yeah, it's a pity,
so,
you know.
Yeah.
I mean, McCartney had a go in Too Many People on his own stuff.
Right.
And it was a bit less subtle than The Only Thing You Ever Did Was Yesterday, and Now You're Gone, You're Just Another Day. You know, it was Those Freaks was right when they said You Was Dead. Well, you know, Lennon doesn't mince his words, and it's not a very good idea to take on a master wordsmith like John Lennon. And you know, there was only going to be one winner.
Yeah,
but it didn't do his reputation, I don't think, any good in the court of public opinion.
The line about Yesterday and Another Day was supposed to come from Alan Klein.
Absolutely, you know.
And
you can just imagine, Ken, when somebody comes up with that and Lennon rubs his hands and thinks that is magnificent. Why didn't I think of that? And then, you know.
And you mentioned there was the writer Felix Dennis. He's the one who observed the session for How Do You Sleep and heard all those other lyrics that were supposed to have been, you know, even more cruel.
Yeah, so, I mean, he was just a guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Was another eyewitness to history, and Ringo Starr was also kicking around, and I think he chastised John and said, "Look, John, that's enough." But Felix, as you rightly say, you know, I don't think he could believe what he was hearing, because most of the people they weren't just liggers or hangers on. Most of them would have been bona fide fans, and you know, I mean, the lyrics would have been very hurtful, and nobody would have been in any doubt about who the target was. So I think it would have been an uncomfortable listening experience.
Sure. Right. Um, you write here that the acrimony, I'm going to use your own words, the acrimony was unnecessarily personal and unnecessarily public. Part of the problem was they remained prisoners of their own storied legacies.
Yeah, I mean, you should have wrote
Yeah,
that.
I wish I wrote it.
Oh, now I think, what the hell does that mean? Um, yeah, I think it's just that they couldn't find they couldn't find that moment to sit down like two normal blokes and try and work things out. And as I say, I think a lot of it's to do with pride. And to be fair to Lennon, he had a lot on his plate, you know, with immigration in America, with Tricky Dicky, and also trying to keep his career from, you know, whooshing down the plug hole, because, you know, sometime in New York City is not his finest moment. So, you know, there's a lot of things. I mean, can you imagine the pressure that they must have been under? I mean, McCartney's solo career is yet to catch fire. Really, it's before Band on the Run. So the two of them, as well as dealing with those everyday questions of when are you guys going to get back together, and then sniping at each other in the press, and then all the things that are going on in their personal lives, and at the same time trying to find the spark to relight their solo careers, at the same time, but incidentally, as George Harrison and Ringo Starr are heading out of sight, they actually do have successful solo careers. So there's a lot of pressure in the background there, and it'd be quite difficult to deal with. There's a lot. They're having to spin a lot of plates, and just trying to maybe the personal relationships between them were not their priorities at the time. Maybe their career had overtaken personal relationships between the two of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I should also point out, since you brought up, you know, taking a while for McCartney to do well, all of his albums did extremely well from the very beginning commercially. You know, the difference is the critical acceptance versus the commercial acceptance. Because here in the States, the first McCartney album was a #1 album, and Ram went to #2, and Wildlife went to #10, and Red Rose Speedway went to #1. And that's quite a very good beginning there for just about any artist. I don't think anyone would complain about that. But,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of people just sometimes they want to brush that aside and say nothing really happened until, say, Live and Let Die and Ben on the Run.
Yeah. It's funny how history can skew your your viewpoint. I mean, it's become fashionable to deride McCartney's first few albums as a solo artist, but look at McCartney on its own. You know, it's a really good record. I mean, maybe I'm Amazed is the greatest record the Beatles never did. You know, can you imagine how it would have soared even further had the four of them been able to play on it? You know, Every Night is also a great track. You know, I mean, it's an album of its time, but and I actually quite like Wildlife. I have to say, you know it's got this homespun DIY attitude, but I quite like Wildlife. And now, of course, we talked about revisionism earlier on, and how, you know, at the time Ram was dismissed as lightweight pop confectionery.
Hmm.
But nowadays, people tend to look back on Ram and think, actually, it was a really good piece of work. And you can see it. You can see momentum beginning to build, as you say, through Ram, Red Rose Speedway, and then of course you get to Band on the Run, and all of a sudden this guy's off and running. But
Right.
maybe he was always off and running. It's just that he took a few records to get into his stride.
Yeah. You know, as someone who loves those solo recordings as they were, I've never been one to feel that if they were Beatle recordings, they would necessarily have been better. I'm just happy with them the way that they came out. I mean, I wouldn't change a thing about All Things Must Pass as an album. You know, I
No,
wouldn't
neither would
necessarily,
I. No, neither would I.
you know, I love the way Maybe I'm Amazed came out. I love the whole sound of the first McCartney album. I love Plastic Ono Band the way it came out. So, you know, I don't adhere to the philosophy that it would have automatically have been better if it was the Beatles doing it. But the mere fact that people think highly enough of the songs to make compilations of their own, this is my Beatles album of 1970 or 71, tells me that they like the songs the way that they came out too. So, you know, I'm
Yeah, I'm
quite
the
happy
same.
with those
Yeah, I'm the
recordings.
same. Yeah, I'm quite happy with them. I mean, when I said Maybe I'm Amazed is the best. I mean, that's a very it's a bit unfair actually on McCartney. I mean, just treat the song on its merits and accept it for what it is,
Hmm.
and just appreciate the genius behind it. So no, I don't. I mean, there's nothing on Plastic Ono Band that I wish was sung by had 3-part harmonies on it, for example.
Right.
So no, I don't. No, you're absolutely right. I have no great desire to to try and mix and match and do a sort of solo Beatles mashup, if you like. You know, that wouldn't
Hmm.
appeal to me in the slightest. No.
Yeah. And just, you know, my opinion here. I love all of John's solo albums, and sometime in New York City, I probably like the least, but there's a lot of killer songs on there for me
Oh,
anyway.
there are
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I mean, my wife's Irish, and somebody has to be, and she'll kill me if she hears that. Well, she'll kill me again. But Luck of the Irish, I think, is a really good track. You know, there's some great songs on it. You know,
Uh-huh.
Angela. You know, I mean, I quite like. I mean, I do like Yoko's contribution to the album. Actually, I think it's really good. You know, so no, I mean, they are products of their time, and maybe we should just accept them warts and all, and be grateful that we do have them as as some milestones in each of their careers.
Okay. Well, I think of the music as timeless. So it's not like I just think of it and automatically I think 1972. But that's, again, that's my opinion. I love New York City as a song. I love Woman is the Nigger of the World as a song. I love the recording that was made and the production behind it as well. So, you know, I never really think of songs as being necessarily products of the time because I still can relate to them and they still sound good to me right now. So that's just
Yeah, I'm the
me.
same actually. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. I mean, I can stick on these albums now, and it doesn't matter whether you heard them in 1972 or 2022, 50
Hmm.
years down the line. Yeah, they still carry a nice up to date resonance for you. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Well, we're going to do one more thing here on the show, and that is we're going to do a Fab Five feature. And we haven't done this for a while on this channel, but that's when I asked my guests to name 5 albums. One is a Beatles album, one from each solo Beatle. And these are the albums that, if you had to pick an album to listen to right now, these are the ones you choose. They don't necessarily have to be your favorite album or what you consider to be the best album from each of the 4 Beatles individually and together. Just what you feel like listening to at the moment. And you're going to tell us, most importantly, why you feel that way. So we're going to start, first of all, with John Lennon. And what album would be your go-to album right now at this moment?
I would take I would take Plastic Ono Band, because it's just a stunning record. You know, I was listening to it today actually, and he doesn't even sound like himself. I mean, it's like this guy stepped from behind the curtain, and vocally he sounds so different. I think it's a harrowing album, but it's a compelling album, right from the funereal bells at the start, tolling for a different future away from the Beatles. As I say, it's this is this guy stripped to he's stripping his soul,
Hmm.
and I mean, it's very cathartic. I understand why people, would find it. It's not very commercial, but it doesn't have to be. This is the zenith of John Lennon's art. in a sense. It's probably the peak. It's probably his most. It's probably the zenith of his avant-garde period in a sense. I think it's a magnificent album. I don't think there's one bad track on it. I love them all. There's also a bit of humour there for if you're living in the UK with remembering the explosion at the end to signify Guy Fawkes Night. But you know, I always think of that album, Ken, as being a bit of a proto-punk album, because it really comes down to guitar, drums, and bass. There's nothing else on it.
Some piano
on it, but there's not very much.
Yeah,
and I think he sounds fantastic. Spector, I know, was involved in the production, but thankfully they must have locked him in a cupboard and put some tape over his mouth, and so you know his footprints, his fingerprints aren't on it in the conventional way they may have been. I think it was probably more produced by Lennon actually, but it's a great record. I love it all, and I don't think he sings. In my opinion, his singing in that album was never bettered, and he's got a great vocal. You know, he's one of the great rock and roll singers of all time. But on that album, it sounds like he could be in the next room to you. It sounds like it's so intimate, it's cloistered, and lyrically, it's just sensational. I just think it was. I'm not saying it was a peak, because I think there are different peaks to different people. You know, I mean, if you ask me tomorrow, I might say Walls and Bridges. If you ask me the day after that, I might say Double Fantasy. But Plastic Ono Band has a certain indefinable quality to it, a magic that you can't quite feel. You know, and I understand it might divide a lot of people who would much rather have Imagine, for example, you know, you know, a bit more sugary than Plastic Ono Band. But Plastic Ono Band, I mean, you know, John, you know, as I said, he wore his heart on his sleeve, and it sounds like a guy going through some kind of personal and professional catharsis. But musically, it's an astonishing piece of work. So I would take Plastic Ono Band.
No argument there. I love what you said about John's voice. Well, John's voice is great on all of his albums, but when you combine that with the bareness of this album, it really brings it even more to the fold. It just stands out.
Yeah, I mean, it's just raw. It's so raw and it's so intimate, and he's singing to you as if you're the only person there.
Yeah.
You know, you just have that feeling that it's so familiar, and you know, that rawness is incredible to listen to. I mean, I was listening to Working Class Hero, and I just think it's such a fabulous song. Some of the lyrics, you know, I mean, you can't help but laugh at some of it. You know, I've seen religion from Jesus. I've seen religion. I've been through it all. I've seen junkies. I've been through all. I've seen religion from Jesus to Paul. Well, I don't think he's talking about the guy in the road to Damascus. You know.
Yep. And what I also love is you have the different voices of John on the album. You've got the very powerful projecting voice and screaming voice like on Mother, and then you've got more restrained on Isolation.
Yeah,
a song like that. Although that middle eight there, it's really powerful. Of the song.
When you listen to a song like Well, 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 and you hear those screams,
yeah.
You know, nobody else could get away with it. You know, people might at the time have thought it was a bit self-indulgent, but the way he sings is really unbelievable. You know, and also the way it goes from Well, 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 and then the next Well, Well, Well is slightly different. You know, vocally. You know, I'm not a musician, but you can't help but be mesmerized by his, you know, he's so vulnerable. It's his vulnerability that really is one of the major attractions to that record. But I do, and I mean, who else would sing a song called "My Mummy's Dead"? You know, I mean, you know, it might be for some people hard to listen to. But I think if you're a John Lennon fan, then when you get on the bus, you're on the bus for the whole journey. And if there are a few potholes in the road, then you just have to expect that. And by that, what I mean is that, this may not have been this was an album that people may not have been expecting. But if you're a John Lennon fan, and you appreciate all the nuances of his career and the type of individual that he was, as I said, whose fidelity to the truth was absolute, then you should appreciate it even more. I think it's an album, Ken, that's actually got better as the years have gone by.
I would agree with you. And you're not the first person to say it was like the start of proto-punk. So I'm glad to hear someone else say that.
Damn, who was it? I want to know. Does that mean I've either A, ripped them off, or they've ripped me off?
You ripped them off. All right, let's move on to Ringo. What Ringo album is your album of choice right now?
It has to be Ringo, the eponymous album. It's a joyous record. The songs are great, and the collaborations are outstanding. He just seemed to find his beat. He just seemed to find his beat and find his feet. And you can tell it's a happy album. The songs are great. He sings them all great. There's not one bad record on it. There's not one bad track on it. And he just seems to me to be having so much fun. And that feeling, or that feel-good factor, is communicated through the grooves of the record. Because you find yourself singing along to all the tracks, and the fact that all three other Beatles contributed to it does lend something magical to it. I do like some of his other solo albums. Actually, he does get a bad rap, in a sense, and a bad rep. But that particular album is a joyous record. It could easily creep into a top 5 solo albums list of all time for me, because I never tire of listening to it. Right. Photograph's a great record, and it's taken on a much more poignancy now that George isn't here anymore. But he sounds great. He sounds great, and the production on it, I think it was Richard Perry.
Right.
The production values, a bit like Plastic Ono Band. The production values are fantastic, and it's just a fun record. And I think he had a number 1 with You're 16 on this side of the pond.
You're 16 and Photograph.
And Photograph.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a brilliant album. It was clearly a recording peak and a chart peak for him. But fair play to him. He stuck by what he wants to do, and we love him for it, don't we? But that particular album is brilliant. It's just brilliant. It might not carry the same kind of musical weight as the others, but for me, it's just a great feel-good record. And it's got all the guys from the band taking part in it, and Levin Helm and Garth Hudson, and you can hear their sort of rustic country influence on some of the tracks, and I just think Ringo, found the right. He works better in collaboration with other people anyway.
Right.
And what made it easier was these were all guys he knew, and it all sounds, Ken, as if they're all pulling in the same direction. They all wanted to do it for him. They all wanted him to have for want of a better phrase, a hit record. I love it. I think it's a great record. It's a great record.
Oh, it's one of the greatest of the solo albums, and I think Ringo's done a lot of fantastic work in recent years, from Time Takes Time on. Yeah. And after the Ringo album, between that and Time Takes Time, there are some great moments. There's no doubt about it. But the Ringo album is solid from track 1 to track 10, and to end with You and Me, Babe. What a great album closer there. And George writing that with Mal Evans. George wrote it with Mal. Hope to find out more in Ken Womack's book about that particular song.
Yeah, but the third Ken.
Yeah. I just wish Ringo would do that one live and close his concerts with that, because that's the perfect song to do that with.
Yeah, it's
But
a shame. It's a shame that he doesn't play more tracks from what is obviously his most successful solo album. And some of them are tailor-made to be played live.
mm,
And can you imagine the audience reaction? That would be they would go through the roof. It would be brilliant.
well, there's a lot of great tracks through the years on all of his solo albums that I wish he would do live, but he sticks to the familiar.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and Oh My was also a top 10 hit here in the US. So he had three big hits from that album. And yeah, I love Sunshine Life for Me. That's such a terrific song with the band on there. It just works. Everything on
yeah. I
that
mean, I
album
love
works.
them all. I mean, even 6 o'clock. It's not McCartney's greatest piece of songwriting by any means, but it just fits Ringo. It just fits.
Oh,
And Sail Away Raymond, and I mean, yeah, I do think it's a flawless album, and you don't get many albums where you actually it becomes so familiar to you that you actually know the running order, even in these days of Spotify. I think that's the hallmark of a great album, that you know the track that will come next.
mm,
Um, and even after all these years, when we used to get albums, Ken, and you used to look in the back of the albums to see the running order
right.
and who wrote that song, and it just became part of your life, really.
Still is.
Yeah, yeah,
The 6 o'clock to me is one of the best songs I think Paul wrote for anybody. So we kind of disagree there. But I think between 6 o'clock and Photograph, as far as contributions for a Ringo song, those are the top two for me, my personal opinion. So
yeah. But it,
yeah,
it really works. It's an epic album,
yeah.
flawless from start to finish. Absolutely. And when I'm the greatest, didn't know, I think, did Lennon not write to him and say, "Why don't you write me a hit song?" or something like that?
Well, I know, well, John wrote it, but when he first wrote it, he was thinking about himself, but then he realized he couldn't put that song out himself. He would be
Yeah,
coming across as being, an egomaniac. I'm the greatest, but
yeah,
everybody would accept Ringo doing it.
yeah,
So it works for Ringo. It's a good opening track, no doubt about it. And he's done that one live a lot. So,
yeah, yeah.
so pick your Beatles album right now.
Well, that is always is really hard. It's really hard. I mean, it's mission impossible. But today I went back to Abbey Road. I went back to Abbey Road. It, I don't think it's a flawless record, but there are some. They seem to, they seem to have finally, moved from that pop star idiom to from pop stars to hippie avatars to out and out rock stars. And I think musically, Abbey Road is such a powerful statement. Each of them, in terms of their musicianship within the band, are really at the peak of their powers. I mean, McCartney's bass work on Abbey Road, it had been for years, to be fair,
Mhm.
but it's sensational. I mean, even his bass work on a track like Something, it's unbelievable.
Yep.
And people hear the song so often that you miss things. Here Comes the Sun has got unbelievable drumming on it, that kind of Indian pattern.
Right.
And the drumming on Here Comes the Sun is like, wow, where did that come from? And I think people, you become very complacent and you just think, well, that's just a drummer. Well, it's more
Uh-huh.
than that, because he lends something distinctive to the song. And then there are a couple of tracks I'm not so keen on, but overall, I do come back to Abbey Road because it just sounds like a fantastic way to go out on top. And we all know the tracks. I mean, this is the beauty of the Beatles. If you take a song like Here Comes the Sun, it's not even a single. You know how you quite often you define bands by the success of their singles. Well,
Right.
the Beatles are one of the great bands in history where it's the album tracks that help to identify them, if more so maybe than some of the singles. And Abbey Road is just a great example of a band at the peak of their powers, and that comes back to what we touched on earlier whereby if Abbey Road was such a high, then how do you follow it? How do you follow it? What happens if the next album isn't as good? Well, people start to say, well, you know, they've had their moment, they're starting to wane, and it becomes a bit of a finger-pointing exercise. I wouldn't have wanted that. Abbey Road is a fabulous full stop on the Beatles recording history.
Right. And, you know, the more that you study their music, whether it's through these archival box sets or somehow you have access to isolated tracks of Beatle recordings. I mean, to listen to Paul's bass line on something alone, that's a work of art, you know. And as you said, what's that?
I was just going to say that, you know, Harrison, I don't think was that impressed by it. You know, he thought it was too busy.
Right.
But that maybe just sums up the relations at the time. You know, I don't think. I mean, I think if you're a bass player, you would look at the bass playing and something as being, you know, a high watermark of bass guitar playing. But I do love Abbey Road. I have some nitpicking, which is in an ideal world, if you look at what happened on All Things Must Pass, if Eagles could have been parked to one side, if John and Paul could have parked their Eagles to one side and maybe given George 2 more tracks on the album instead of maybe Maxwell, then I think Abbey Road would have been out of sight as the greatest album ever made, you know. But I understand why you couldn't have a track like All Things Must Pass on Abbey Road, because lyrically it's quite clear, you know, what he's talking about. And 1 or 2 other tracks from All Things Must Pass would have been difficult maybe for them all to sing together. But the medley will stand as one of the greatest musical moments of all time. And of course, to end it all with McCartney's cosmic couplet, you know, it never fades. The glory of Abbey Road never fades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of miracles when you're talking about the Beatles, but how that medley worked the way that it did, when you have all these songs that were not finished, and somehow the way that they recorded it, it worked so well and flowed so well together, it does come across as though it's all one piece of work, you know, and it's miraculous. There's so many miracles in the Beatles story there. And a lot of their music is very deceptive. You might think a song like Here Comes the Sun is very simple, and it's not very simple, because there's a lot of different time signature changes in there. And you know, give all the credit to Ringo, how he was able to make it all sound so smooth on the drums, you know. Whatever the Beatles needed to do to make their records sound good, they knew what to do intuitively, and they also had, you know, a great producer and great engineers around them too. So they benefited from that.
Yeah, I think George Martin, especially, you can tell how important he was when he returned to do Abbey Road. You know, George Martin's hallmarks as a producer are all over Abbey Road. That cleanness of sound, that purity of sound. But I do think that, I mean, you know, I like to talk about Ringo and Abbey Road because, you know, it's easily, I think his drumming in Abbey Road and Let It Be, incidentally, are really fantastic. I just think that he'd moved into his own, you know, and his drumming is, I mean, think of the drum pattern on Come Together, for example. I know it's such an intrinsic part of the song. And I think, like everything else, you know, over the years, I think he's become more appreciated now than he was then. Probably an age thing. But that medley, certainly, you know, the songs couldn't have worked on their own. And even a song like I Want You, She's So Heavy, it's just fantastic. It's just, you know, there's a magical quality to Abbey Road that's like an alchemy in a sense. But that alchemy had been visible for 6 years before that. You know, it's not something that happened overnight. But I just feel Abbey Road was the right way to step off the page, in a sense. And I do love it. I do love it. I mean, when I listen to Golden Slumbers, McCartney's singing is really unbelievable. He's
Mm.
just, I mean, we talk about them. I know in America, that I used to say that in America the Beatles were still regarded as divinities. Not maybe so much over here, but I can't think of another group of musicians whose legacy has endured for such a long time. I did a radio thing over in the UK and in Scotland not so long ago, and I think the interviewer was a bit taken aback. It was when McCartney was 80, and I compared him to Mozart,
Hmm.
and I think he was a bit taken aback. I mean, I know you need the four of them to create the magic, but McCartney has something slightly different. And I say that as a John fan, really.
Hmm.
And I think the interviewer was taken aback slightly that I had the temerity to compare James Paul McCartney to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But
Hmm.
all I meant was that, in a sense, will we still be listening to the Beatles music in 200 years' time? Well, we're already a quarter of the way there. So I think it's entirely feasible that, that music will survive the eons. Yeah.
I certainly hope so. I
I
think
mean,
it
you
will.
you and I will be long gone.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's no telling what people are going to be enjoying in the future. But the mere fact that it's 50 to 60 years old already and new generations are discovering that music, that alone is something I don't take for granted, you know?
No.
So I'm very grateful for that. Um, how about George Harrison?
Well, George Harrison, it had to be. It was a toss up between Brainwashed, Cloud Nine, and All Things Must Pass. I've gone for All Things Must Pass simply because it never sounds dated. It sounds as fresh today as when I first heard it. Um, and this was George, the dark horse, coming up on the inside rail and surprising everybody and winning the race. Um, of all four Beatles by a furlong, really. Um, Again, not unlike the Ringo album, he has a collegiate approach to it, a collaborative approach with a stellar cast of musicians, from Clapton, obviously, Peter Frampton, and all these guys, obviously wanting to play a part in making the record work. But at the end of the day, what makes the record is the songs, and the songs have never aged. They've never, not withered in my mind. I don't play the jam very much, but
Hmm.
the actual two records with all the songs on them, I love them. I absolutely love them. I think he sounds full of confidence. It's as if that he's realised that by leaving one world behind, he's entering a new world, and he wants to grab this opportunity with both hands.
Hmm.
Um, and I wonder, I wonder what the others thought about All Things Must Pass when they heard it, because they must have heard a lot of these songs in the studio, taking shape in some form or another, and yet, dismissing them. And I understand why. It's very difficult to break the mold of Lennon McCartney, two very powerful personalities. But George Harrison just seems to me to have, in All Things Must Pass, he created an album for the ages.
Yeah, well, we certainly had a backlog of songs building up over the last few years. And yeah, it's just an amazing collection, song for song. And I love the production behind it. Love Phil Spector's production, the playing on there, all the slide guitar work. Eric Clapton does great guitar work on there. Alan White is supposed to be all over the album. Ringo's on there. So, George always had great musicians on all of his solo albums. So, but yeah, but then you also, uh, there's a lot of people who will say you never can top All Things Must Pass. And the mere fact that it's a double album worth of great material, that's even better than one great album of material if he follows it up with that. So it's tough to compete with something like that.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's all about the songs. It's all about the songs, you know. I mean, he's different from Lennon. He's not out to try and make some kind of political statement. He's not like McCartney, who's desperately trying to find some commercial traction. George just does what George wants to do,
Hmm.
and if it works, then yeah, great, fantastic. I mean, you know, a song like "What Is Life" it shimmers with immortality for me,
Hmm.
a song like that. And then you've got a bit of humour with it, with Apple Scruffs. Um, you know, Isn't It a Pity is still a great, great song. I mean, when I touched on earlier about a couple of Harrison tracks on Abbey Road, Isn't It a Pity might have come into contention, but you couldn't possibly have had a song with that lyrical content on Abbey Road. I mean, that would just
Hmm.
have precipitated bad relations even more. Um, but
Kind of like you couldn't have had Wawa.
you couldn't have had Wawa either.
Yeah, right.
A bit
Or
like
run of the mill.
How Do You Sleep?
Hmm.
If you take the track on its standalone merits, it's a great piece of work.
Yeah.
It's an unbelievable. It's a great piece of work. So, I'll always take George with me. But it was a bit of a coin toss because I do like Cloud Nine. I do like Living in the Material World. Underrated record. Underrated record.
Okay.
There's some great stuff on it, and I do like Brainwashed. So it was a tough choice. It was a tough ask, and caused me some mental consternation.
Hmm.
But I came down to All Things Must Pass. But ask me again tomorrow, and I will change my mind.
You know, I was just thinking when you were talking about the Abbey Road album, and it might have been better if you took out Maxwell Silverhammer and put in a George Harrison song. And I was just thinking about that meeting that the Beatles had in September of '69, where John proposed an equal amount between him and Paul and George, 4 songs apiece, and Ringo gets, I think, 2. So at least the thought was there for a very brief time that John came up with that idea. So
Yeah, it would have been interesting. That tape is interesting. It would have been interesting, whether in nice idea in theory, but in practice, there would have been a lot of gnashing of teeth, I think, in order for George to get 4 songs in an album. They would have had to be really strong contenders. I
hmm.
think McCartney probably was a bit of a control freak when it came to, because he only wants the best for the band,
Right.
and perhaps he might have loosened the strings a wee bit. I mean, I do think that when you look back in it, that I mean, it's interesting that "Here Comes the Sun" is the most streamed Beatles song on
Hmm.
Spotify, and it's not even a Lennon McCartney song.
Right.
And I do think that "While My Guitar Gently Weeps" is the one Beatles song for me which even now gets better with age. It gets better with every playing, and don't ask me why. I can't put my finger on it. It just sounds so good. So George came flying out the traps with "All Things Must Pass." There's an argument for saying that perhaps commercially he never quite scaled the same peaks again. But I don't think that bothered George too much. I think the other record, of course, is the George Harrison album,
Hmm.
which is also a great record. So, he may not have been so productive as McCartney over the years, but, George made some great records, delivered some killer tracks, and had, I think his family should always be proud of his contribution to music post the Beatles. But I do like All Things Must Pass. It's hard to see past it today.
I think his family is very proud of his
Yeah,
accomplishments after the Beatles, as they
yeah,
should be.
rightly
Yeah,
so.
for me, George has been consistently strong from All Things Must Pass On. I mean, you can always point to what you think are his weakest albums, which for me would probably be Somewhere in England or Extra Texture. But the George Harrison album is a killer album. That one
Yeah,
and 33 and a third back to back, or magnificent for
Yeah,
me anyway.
brilliant.
Anyway, let's end with Paul.
With Paul again, difficult choice. It always would be, but I'm going to go for Tug of War.
Okay.
I'm going to go for Tug of War because he sounds like a different Paul McCartney to me. He sounds like somebody who's shed his pop star clothing, if you like, and he sounds much more mature. It's a bit like Frank Sinatra in the 60s in a sense, that, he's no longer, he's obviously not a Bobby Soxer type of artist anymore. There's a maturity to him. If you imagine a song like It Was a Very Good Year. So McCartney sounds a bit like somebody who's moved into a different phase of his life and a different phase of his career. And it was his third actual solo album after McCartney 2, and then Tug of War. And he sounds like somebody, who's come. It sounds like somebody who looks back in his life and thinks, who was I, who am I, and how did I get here? Tug of War, to put it in some kind of calendar perspective, happens obviously after he was jailed in Japan for his drugs bust, which is obviously a moment where he may have taken stock of his life. It happens when Wings have disbanded, so he's also taking stock of his career. And most significantly of all, of course, it's his first album after Lennon has been murdered. So that's a pivotal moment in anybody's life, but most importantly in the life of Paul McCartney. So all these elements are in play, I feel, that and comes together to make Tug of War is a great record. It's a great record. It's a guy who's looking back in his life. There's a lot of nostalgia in the record, but it's not. He doesn't overdose in sentiment. If you imagine the album opener, Tug of War, is clearly a look back at his relationship with John and the sibling rivalry that sparked their creative muse, in a sense, and their creative relationship. You've also got a song like Ballroom Dancing, where he remembers going to local ballrooms, and the one thing in his mind, the only thing in his mind is girls. He's looking for girls, and he's no different than any other young guy of that age. It's the attraction of the fairer sex which really takes you there. And Carol Perkins is involved in the album, which is a nod to his boyhood heroes. And then, of course, there are great tracks on it, Ken. Tug of War, Ballroom Dancing, Wanderlust is one of the great McCartney gems of his entire career. But the emotional centerpiece of Tug of War has to be Here Today, which is his love letter to his fallen comrade, his fallen brother. And it's a real emotional punch to the gut, really, and it's never lost that emotional appeal to me. There are so many versions of it over the years where he plays it live, and you can tell, even no matter how many times he plays it, how important the song is to him. There was never a better Lennon tribute than in my mind. We had Elton John's Empty Garden, which is quite nice. Mike Oldfield did Moonlight Shadow, which has a reference to Lennon in it, bit subtle, but it's there. But Here Today remains the most compelling Lennon tribute of them all, and who better to deliver it than Paul McCartney?
And he's obviously very proud of that song, to the point where for the last, 20 years, he's been doing it live in all of his concerts. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. When you listen to Tug of War, it doesn't sound anything like a Wings album. It doesn't sound like a band album. This is where Paul took his time and chose all the musicians that he wanted, whether you said Carl Perkins, Stevie Wonder, of course, Ringo is on there on Take It Away with Steve Gadd on drums. Great variety on the album. George Martin masterfully produced that album. So it clicked on all cylinders. It has that emotional pull because it was the album after John died, much like Double Fantasy will always have that for me, being the album that we associate with John when he was murdered. So, but Paul's vocals all throughout Tug of War are outstanding. I always love the duets with Stevie Wonder too.
Well,
So
I was just going to mention that actually. I was just going to mention that because I think that's you've hit the nail on the head. That what's that you're doing is an incredible piece of funk. And
yep.
who would ever have thought that Paul McCartney would have been a funk artist, if you like?
Right.
It's almost got a Sly and the Family Stone groove to it. And I love the vocals on it. I love Stevie Wonder's contribution to it. And it's a fun track with about "She Loves You" at the end, and that bass line. I'm not sure whether Paul plays the bass on that or whether in fact it's Stanley Clarke plays the bass on it. I think he was involved in the album as well.
The Paul and Stevie, I'm pretty sure, are the only musicians on that song.
On it, yeah. But again, the bass line,
yeah,
the bass line is wow.
right.
It just crackles. And I love that track. I love that track. I mean, there's not an out and out rock song on it. I don't think. I mean, as I said, there's a bit of humour there. Carl Perkins laughing at the end of that track is really nice. It's a lovely moment, and I think Carl Perkins, because he was taking part in the sessions in Montserrat, did he not mention? Is there not a story about Carl Perkins saying to him something along the lines of, remember me, think of me now and again, old friend.
My old friend.
My old friend.
Yeah, the song is a song that Carl Perkins wrote. And when he presented that song to Paul remembered that those were the last words that John said to him.
Yeah.
Think of me now and again, old friend. So
and that was almost like an emotional release for him. In a sense, if the story's correct, and that's a nice story to hear, that perhaps he needed that emotional outlet. But all the stars were in alignment. You mentioned George Martin, and again, an important component of this album. But I just think he sounds slightly different on it. In a sense, it was his other albums throughout that era of the 80s are not as strong as Tug of War, and I think it took him a while to find some traction again after that album. But I just think it's a great album. Great, I mean, what's not to like? Great songs, great vocals, great playing, great production, a great cast of collaborative musicians, and it just works. The album, the nearest album after that, Ken, for me, was Flaming Pie. Was the album, I think, after that, which I think came closest to Tug of War, to reaching that peak for me. Although I do like some stuff in Press to Play. I think we all like some tracks on all the albums, but for me, Tug of War is a nice cohesive collection of tracks that somehow or other seem to work and flow together.
Okay, well, I'm not going to argue with you here. I think it's another perfect album from Paul. Although, for me, the 80s Paul may be my favorite period of Paul, because I love Press to Play and Flowers in the Dirt a lot. So
Flowers in the Dirt is certainly good. Yeah, I'd forgotten about Flowers in the Dirt, actually. I was thinking about Pipes of Peace and Press to Play, but Flowers in the Dirt is certainly, I could have chosen that, actually. Flowers in the Dirt is a tour de force in itself. Yeah, definitely.
That's my favorite McCartney album.
Is that right?
Yeah. Don't get me wrong, I love Paul in all the decades, and certainly the 70s. I wouldn't argue with anyone that loves Paul in the 70s the most. He put out the most pop music in the 70s. He had the most commercial success in the 70s, and he had a lot of hit records in the 70s, one of the biggest hit makers of the 70s. But, I just think he matured more after the days of Wings as an artist. And I like when he works more with different songwriters and different producers. I think that makes him work a little bit harder on his music. We all have different opinions on this, and that's what makes the world go round here.
It does, and he's not going to be with us forever, Ken.
Right.
And I think we should treasure his output, his contribution, his legacy, because he won't be here forever. Although, judging from what I watched this morning at Glastonbury, the guy must keep a portrait in the attic, because he obviously vegetarianism. Maybe I should think about that. But he looks fantastic. So does Ringo. These guys. How did they do it? And also, how do you? I always think from a live musician's point of view, how the blazes can you remember to play all these songs? I can't remember what I did last week. Never mind having to remember chords, what lyrics. Over such a vast expanse of time, 60 years. I don't know how it's done. But I think we should treasure these guys and be grateful for being alive during their lifetimes. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, you're speaking my language, Ken. I treasure everything that these four guys have given us, group, solo. Anytime there's anything new coming out, and at this point, I've said it many times, I don't feel like I'm owed anything. Everything is all, icing on the cake at this point. But, I look forward to any new music from Paul, any new music from Ringo, any archival stuff from the Beatles and John and George. And I think we've been blessed so many times over. And so, this is the most amazing legacy of all, is that of the Beatles. Once you combine the group and the solo works, there's more great music there than from anybody, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think there's only one way to describe it, Ken, and that is fab.
Yes. Ken, thanks so much. Once again, hold up your book.
Oh, here we are. We'll say it in a sort of a Sean Connery accent. Sure, you started it. You started it. But I quite like this book. I have to say, I quite like it. It's I like the stories and I like the words, and I don't normally say that about my own stuff, but this one I quite like. So, and I finished another one. I've got another Beatles book cooking out in the back burner, and it's actually done. So it's been edited at the moment, and will be out next year. And I don't want to say too much about it, but it is a prequel to And in the End.
Oh, okay.
So
very good.
Watch that space, as they say.
Okay. And for those of you who would like to purchase your book, I'm going to put an Amazon link there. Also the one for And in the End. And even before And in the End, you had a book, The Beatles in Scotland. And is that still available?
Yes, it is. It costs quite a lot of money in the States, but you can get it online if you shop around. You started it, you can get in Barnes and Noble in America, as well as Amazon and other retailers. And in the End is still out there, yeah, and doing well. I couldn't believe I got a book published in America, but American people, guys, the audience over there have been really brilliant. And I love them for it. They're very passionate and they're very quick to have an engagement with you over events and things that you might not have got right. Thankfully, that didn't happen very often. But no, and you know what it's like, Ken. If you get something wrong, then they'll descend upon you like a plague of locusts. But all the feedback I had was very positive, so I was very grateful for that. Yeah.
Well, I love all the information that's in And in the End, and especially the format to go month by month. You kind of feel like you're living it with the Beatles.
And, well, the next one's taking the same format month by month, and it's a prequel.
So. Okay, all right. And in case anybody would like to hear the other interview that I did with you, when N in the End came out. It's on my website. I'll put the link up for that. Thanks to all of you for watching. Ken, thanks for being here. And when the new book comes out, you know, you have a place right here on this channel.
Well, listen, I'd like to say thanks for having me on, and I'd like to wish everybody a very happy Crimble.
Yes, happy Christmas, wonderful Christmas time.
Season's greetings and all that.
Yes, I want to be Santa Claus, all that stuff. Thanks to all of you for watching, and also, well, unless I have some more interviews coming up before the end of the year, Happy New Year. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.